Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
We are in show number 4.
Yes, we are.
I would say the title, but I'm sure that I'll chop it up, so I'm going to let you introduce it again.
Well, actually, I chop it up all the time, too. These are the two monos. It's monophysites and monotheletes.
I knew I wasn't going to try that.
Monotheletes, okay. And then also we have yet another group, which I didn't put into the title, which are the iconoclasts.
Okay.
So we'll be talking about all three of those today. I was just talking earlier on about this time last week when I looked at these notes and what we would be covering. I thought, well, this is kind of esoteric. Who would know about and who would care about the Emperor Heraclitus? Who would care, and who cares about these monos, the monophysites and the monotheletes and the iconoclasts and all that? And then, of course, over this past week, we've seen all throughout the world these incredible riots and burnings of embassies and rock throwings and everything else as a result of the iconoclast doctrine of Islam. And of course we have those Danish cartoons, right. Regardless of whether they were done in poor taste or not, and they certainly were. This is a living issue. And so later on, as we get into this program, and we see that there were whole cities rioting and in rebellion, whole countries in rebellion over this. Well, in fact, people did take this stuff seriously, just as they do today in some parts of the world.
And history repeats itself.
There you go again, yeah. Well, last time around we looked at the Emperor Justinian and how he was able to hold the empire together, do a number of good things. Certainly the law code is something that there was a lasting legacy. Hold the empire in the East together. Now we have yet another very powerful individual who comes along and holds the empire together at a time of great crisis. And this is the Emperor Heraclitus. And he himself, interestingly enough, is an Armenian. So we have Justinian, who was born over in Albania. Now we have someone from Armenia, which is, of course, the plains of Central Asia Minor, today Turkey. And so he was from Asia Minor. However, he didn't look at all like what you would think of as someone from the Middle East. He himself had light golden hair. And did not have Middle Eastern features at all. And when he was made emperor, his proclamation was this: power must shine more in love than in terror.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. It's the exact opposite of Machiavelli, of course. But that was his motto. Unfortunately, reality stepped in and made it very difficult for him to be able to pursue this. And one of the realities was the attack against his empire by the Persians. Here you have a Persian empire, that's present-day Iran, of course, comes storming across what is today present-day Iraq and into Syria, attacking the cities of Antioch and Damascus, and in 614 actually attacking the city of Jerusalem itself. And you have a terrible slaughter. Many of these are already very old and ancient sites of Christian worship. You have, for instance, the destruction, the burning and looting of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And many of the sites were destroyed. Interestingly enough, one that wasn't was the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And the reason is because the scene in that, the mosaic in that, shows the three magi, and they're wearing garb typical of Persians. And so when they got there and saw that, they said, "Oh, these be
These are
good
okay."
guys," and left them alone. Yeah. Anyway, in Jerusalem itself, there was a terrible massacre. Estimates are wide and ranging, but there is one estimate that as many as 60,000 Christians were slaughtered in this taking of Jerusalem. It's led to a lot of controversy because there are only so many sources available that describe this, and one of those is of a monk by the name of Antiochus Strategos. And he wrote a history. Now, it's obvious from his own chronicle that he himself is anti-Semitic. And so, as he describes the Persian attack, and then goes on to describe a fifth column within Jerusalem of indigenous Jewish populations that came in as allies to the Persians. And but we have to take a certain amount of that with a grain of salt. On the other hand, the fact of the matter is that after the attack in 614, when the Persians left, they turned the city over to a rabbi, and for 3 years, until his death, there was a Jewish government that ran Jerusalem. And so that would give us some indication that in fact there was some collusion between the Jewish population and the Persians against the Byzantine population. Quite honestly, you wouldn't necessarily fault them for that. The Byzantines were not always the best to live under, and maybe they thought they could get a better deal with the Persians. As it turned out, they didn't. 3 years later, the Persians came back and took over on their own. So anyhow, there was this slaughter of Christians, and not only that, but also the relics of the true cross were then seized by the Persians and brought back to Iran. Now, these had been venerated for centuries. And not only were the relics sent off, but also the patriarch of Jerusalem, a man by the name of Zacharias, the Christian patriarch, was himself taken by the Persians and brought back to Persia.
Wow.
The Persian general was a man by his nickname is Sharbazar. He's a Persian general. He had some Roman influences. I'm not sure whether he had studied in the Byzantine Empire or whether he was Byzantine, had converted over to the Persian. I'm not sure. But anyway, the term itself, Sharbazar, means royal pig.
Oh.
So obviously that's a nickname. That's not his real name. Well, it wasn't only the if the Persians got help from the indigenous populations, it wasn't only Jewish help. They also received help from the Nestorians and the Monophysites, which I'll say a little bit about a little bit later on.
Okay.
Even to the point of the taking of the city of Alexandria in Egypt in 618. So you have a Persian army that has come all the way into present-day Turkey, which of course is the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern heart of it. And to make matters worse now, other wolves are looking around and they see an opportunity and they jump for it. The Slavs up north of the Danube River come flowing over into the Balkans. Again, this is Byzantine territory, but now it's undefended, and so they come in over in Spain. The Visigoths, this is a Germanic tribe that has conquered Spain, but there are sections of Spain, especially along the coastlines, which are still under Byzantine control. That's all lost to the Byzantine Empire now. And so they're just all of these coming in at once, and that's not even bringing up the Arabs that have converted to Islam, which I'll talk about later on also. So as a result, Heraclius has a lot of problems. And so what he does is he then turns to the churches. He goes to the Patriarch of Constantinople and says, this is really bad. We need everybody's help. And the Patriarch of Constantinople allowed for the turning in the Christian churches all throughout the East of gold vessels and vestments and everything else that was gold, and it was melted down.
Wow.
All this was melted down, and then a significant portion of it was given to the Slavs as tribute so that they would go north of the Danube River and not attack again. So they were bought off. The rest of the money was taken to raise an army, a professional army, and to outfit it. And with that, the emperor then marches his army across into Asia Minor, and in 622 there is a big battle between the Persians and the Greeks, the Byzantines, and the Greeks won. And with that, Jerusalem will be returned. It's going to take 6 years now. But ultimately, the city of Jerusalem is going to fall again to the Byzantines, be restored as a Christian city, and the Byzantine army will continue marching all the way across northern Iraq, taking the city of Mosul, which is in our news all the time anyway,
Yes.
and across even further beyond the Tigris River. And in 627, they'll be at another victory, and this time the Persians will sue for peace. And with this, they agree to vacate Egypt, Syria, Palestine, which they've lost already by now, and also to return the true cross.
Wow.
Now here's an incredible scene in 630 AD, in which the emperor Heraclius takes now the true cross and personally returns it to Jerusalem. And when he enters Jerusalem, he is literally carrying it on his back,
Oh my God.
the relic of the cross. Isn't that something?
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, and historians have said that that had to have been, for him, the highlight of his life.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah. How do you beat that one? Yeah. But as a result of this great victory, he also inherited all of the Monophysites that he'd been quarreling with all these years, especially in the two cities of Antioch and of Alexandria. And, of course, I just want to say a couple words about a new form of monotheism coming out of the Arabian Peninsula, and that, of course, is Islam. Now, interestingly enough, when the Greeks first heard about this, they had assumed that this was a form of Arab Arianism.
Oh,
I'll say
really?
a couple things about Arius a little bit later on.
Okay.
But yeah, they thought it was actually a Christian heresy.
Oh.
And so they dealt with it basically that way. In fact, that concept stayed all the way throughout the Middle Ages, and many people considered Islam to be a Christian heresy, a form of Arianism. So much so that when Dante wrote the Inferno in the 28th canto in Hell, this is the place where heretics are, he placed Muhammad, assuming that he was a Christian. Well, later on, another program, we'll talk a little bit about Muhammad himself and his monotheism and what it actually was. It was not a form of Christianity, but it would be easy enough to misunderstand that at the beginning, because he was one of, let me put it this way, there were 4 Arabs who spoke against the polytheism of the Arabs. Okay, at the Kaaba in Mecca, and 3 of the 4 eventually became Christians. Okay, it was the 4th one who did not, and ultimately will be an inspiration for Muhammad. So it's understandable that they would have misunderstood this. The fact of the matter is that there is a perfect storm brewing down in the Arabian Peninsula, and the Greeks would have been well to have paid attention to it. They didn't. They should have. First of all, there is a very large population taking place, a population boom taking place in Arabia, which cannot be supported by the environment. So that's going to be an issue. Secondly, you have for the first time in Arabian history a cohesion of people that you'd never had before. There were always intertribal rivalries.
Right.
Islam will unite the Arabs in a way that they had never been united before. Then, following Muhammad will be 4 very charismatic leaders. They're known as the caliphs, or the successors. And these are going to be Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. Each of them have their own particular characteristics. 3 of the 4 will die violently. We'll talk about that later on also. But each of them is going to impact this new religion in such a way as to cause it to spread. And this is going to, of course, be a challenge to the Byzantine Christians. Mm-hmm. On top of this, part of this perfect storm is that the Persians and the Byzantines have just bloodied each other with terrible battles and a terrible set of wars, and so both of their religions are going to be weakened, both Christianity among the Byzantines and Zoroastrianism among the Persians. And then added one more layer on all of this is the fact that there is no loyalty to Constantinople on the part of the Nestorians, the Monophysites, and the Jewish populations of that Eastern Empire. And so what you'll have then is a swelling of Islam out of the Arabian Peninsula, and ultimately the true cross itself has to again be evacuated. This time they evacuated
took it out of the head.
Yeah, and brought it to Constantinople. But ultimately, Alexandria is going to be sacked. The great warrior Caliph Omar himself personally sees this and sends back a report that in Alexandria itself there were 4,000 villas. These are, big mansions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Along with that, some 4,000 baths, public baths, some 40,000 tax-paying Jews, and some 400 places of entertainment. So Alexandria was an incredible city, at the time. And then later, it's going to become all the more difficult because the Arab Muslims are going to remember that they are basically a desert nomadic people, but they're going to learn nautical skills, how to sail, and with that the whole Eastern Mediterranean is opened up to them, so that they're going to conquer Cyprus and Rhodes. When they get to Rhodes, they're going to destroy the Colossus. It's part of that iconoclasm we're talking about there. And then raids as far west as Sicily and Crete, so there's that expansion. And even the city itself of Constantinople was attacked in 677. And what saved the city there was a secret weapon called Greek fire. And this is a fire that burned even on water.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
How did they do that?
Huh?
How did they do that?
It's a secret.
Oh, it's still a secret. Okay.
Yeah, there are lots of formula for it, but we don't even know the formula to this day. And how this is done is it was put into a canister, and then the canister was pushed down on, and so there was a tube that shot this fire out over the waters, and it would catch boats on fire. But the deal was that the fire remained on the water itself, so that even if the boat wasn't hit and the ship went into the fiery water, it would catch fire.
Oh my God.
And of course, these are all wooden ships with canvas sails, so boom, it would go right. And that's what saved. That's what saved Constantinople. Well, it didn't save the Christian empire. Even in 699, the Muslims had made their way all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, and they crossed over Gibraltar, which, by the way, is named after a Muslim, and then began the conquest of Spain, which is, of course, going to be a huge 700-year battle, which is finally going to come to an end in 1492, when Grenada itself falls back to the Christians. Everywhere the Arab language spreads, and as we as Christians look at the results of all of this, it's very saddening, of course, to see the great the North African churches now fall to the prey of Islam. These are the churches that supported people like Augustine. Origen, Cyril of Alexandria. I mean, the greats, and now they themselves are laid low. One thing that does happen is that there is toleration of Christians and Jews in this Arab world. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on too. Now, here's where Heraclius sees that if the empire is going to survive, it's going to have to survive based upon a strong unity and a unity of faith. He sees this, and so it's important now for all Christians in the Byzantine Empire to basically be singing off the same page. And the biggest issue he's dealt with in his life, and Justinian dealt with, and they've been dealing with ever since Arius came along, was the nature of Jesus Christ. Who is this Jesus Christ? What does this mean? And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take a little sidestep, and do a little bit of Christological review. Okay, a little bit of Christology here. I don't want to go too deep into this. But the fact of the matter is that when we're dealing about the nature of Christ, we're dealing with a mystery. Yes. And I don't mean a Hercule Poirot or Miss Marvel mystery. It's not, or Sherlock Holmes mystery. That's not what I mean by that. What I mean is that it is a truth that has been revealed to us because we could not have reasoned this out ourselves. There is much about God that we know from nature. Just go to Romans 1, and St. Paul will tell us about that. But there are things about God that only God has revealed to us. The Trinity is one, and the nature of the Incarnation itself. There's a lot at stake in our understanding of what the true nature of Christ is. And part of this concern, this controversy between Arius, the priest, on the one hand, and Athanasius, the archdeacon, on the other. Now, we're going back before this part of the course gets started, but we need to do a little bit of running up on this, is answering the question that Jesus asked at Caesarea Philippi, who do you say that I am? Now, what was happening was that there were many Christians, many people who had been baptized and had come to the conclusion and said this: you are the Christ. You are the greatest human being ever to live. You are the Son of God. You are the first Son of God. But you are not God. That's Arius. And those who would follow him are Arian. And so the problem, of course, that Athanasius saw with this is that if that were true, if Christ is not God, then he cannot save us. Only God can forgive our sins, because our sins are against him.
Right.
And this intermediary would not have the authority to forgive sins, which, of course, we remember in John 20:21, he then passes on to his disciples, right, to the apostles, to do that. So there are those people who are arguing that Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, was a human being, a man, but that he was not God. Pretty close to it, but not quite. Now, there are others who are going to counter in the other direction and go, well, no, Christ is God, but if he's God, he couldn't be a human being. I mean, how could that be? He is so totally other. God is so totally other, so totally transcendent. He wouldn't and couldn't mire himself in our humanity.
Which
and of
is
course,
where Satan was.
There you go. And Athanasius, of course, chimes in with this too, and he says he cannot save what he has not assumed. So what we have here is that Christ takes on the full human nature in order to redeem that human nature. In other words, and this comes, of course, finally from the Council of Nicaea, that Jesus Christ is true God and true man. Those words just flow off of our lips every Sunday at Mass. But if we were to take a moment and think about what those mean, it's pretty significant.
Yes.
In other words, our understanding of God and our understanding of ourselves is tied up with our understanding of Christ. And that's why Christians have a unique anthropology. We often refer to it as a Christian anthropology. Our understanding of what it is to be human is infused with a Christological sense. Christ is the convergence of human nature and godly nature. He's the convergence. He's where the two come together and meet. We try to understand that from abstract philosophy, it's going to fail. We can't wrap our minds around this. It's too big of a thing. And so in what we do instead is we make sense of this by understanding it personally. That's why, the formula, the concept of the Trinity as being three persons in one is an incredibly revolutionary concept. And it really has a lot to do with one pope, and that's Pope Leo the Great, Leo the First. It all has to do with the understanding of the word person, and there, if we just take a moment and go back into our dictionaries, Greek and Latin dictionaries, we find that in the ancient world there was no word for person in the sense that we have for a person today. Our definition really comes from St. Leo. And the reason for this is, you can jump and say, well, wait a minute, there was a word for person in Latin, persona, right? But a persona, you go back to your Greek dictionaries, actually means, in the ancient times, actually meant that it was a character in a play. Okay, so the concept of being a person, I am a person, was not a Roman concept. The Greeks also lacked the same idea of that individual. Now, Warren Carroll does a wonderful job, and I'll give you the page number, in fact. On page 107, he very succinctly, in about 2 paragraphs, describes this whole issue in his book, The Building of Christendom. That's the 2nd volume of that great big work that he has. But I've also come across another book that helps describe this, and I'd just like to read this little brief summary. This was published in 2005, and the title is very recent, and the title of it is The Victory of Reason, and it's by Rodney Stark. And he argues in his book that Christianity is the foundation for what comes in Western civilization in freedom and in capitalism, and also what he calls Western success. That Christianity is uniquely set up among all the ideologies and all the religions to honor the individual person, the human dignity of the person, and more specifically the sense of what it means to be a person, and then our relationship with nature. And that leads to freedom in its highest sense, and human dignity. But I think it's important for us to understand that this idea of person, and because that's how we understand God as a trinity of persons, and we also understand ourselves that way. I am me, and we know what that means. Or a teenager said, well, that's the way I am. And we, well, okay, whatever. But listen to what Rodney Stark says in his book, The Victory of Reason, when he's talking here about this sense that Christianity, and particularly now we're talking about Pope Leo and about the Nicene Creed and that concept of persons of God. Remember, man is created in the image and likeness of God, and so anyway, I'm going to let him talk. Okay. He says the following. He says, the blessings of a theology of reason were not confined to the sciences. From the earliest days, Christianity was equally inventive in its conception of human nature and in confronting issues of morality. Chief among these were propositions concerning fundamental human rights, such as liberty and freedom. And underlying these ideas was something even more basic, the discovery of the individual, of the self. The notion that individualism was discovered seems absurd to the modern mind. To some extent it is. All normal human beings know themselves as separate creatures who necessarily look out upon the world from a unique point of vision and whose nerve endings are absolutely singular. We understand that. Nevertheless, some cultures emphasize feelings of separate individuality while others stress collectivity and suppress the sense of self. In the latter kind of culture, which seem to be the great majority, a person's real sense of being is quite collective. Whatever rights individuals possess are accorded not to them, but to their group, and are in turn conferred upon them by their group. When you look at the relationship between the family and the individual in the Roman family, in the Roman society, that's exactly what happens. I only have worth because I'm a member of this group. And this is true of most of the ancient world, including the two groups that we would think to be most individualistic, Greeks and Romans. They weren't. So this is something that comes later. He says, then, in such circumstances, no one supposes that I am the master of my fate. Instead, it is the idea of fatalism that rings true, that one's fate is beyond one's control, being fully determined by greater external forces. Then he goes on and says this, in contrast, it is the individual citizen who was the focus of Christian political thought, and this in turn implicitly shapes the views of later European political philosophers such as Hobbes and of Locke, and then he goes on beyond there. But I think here's the key, is our understanding of God as a trinity of persons, and that idea of a person, of an autonomous being in Jesus Christ as being an individual human person and an individual divine person. There's that confluence of the two coming together, and that's why orthodoxy with the little o and these monos come into such conflict, and that's why it's so important to keep these straight.
Yes.
And that's what happens when you have the Council of Nicaea, and then every council reconfirming after that the true nature of Jesus Christ as true God and true man. Now that's the orthodox little o position. That's what comes from the councils. That is what is always confirmed, taught, and explained by the popes.
Okay.
But not everybody can grasp that.
Sure.
And so there are those who, like the Monophysites, who claim that there is only one nature, that Jesus Christ is in one nature. And here you have the situation then where an emperor finds himself with two groups of Christians arguing about the nature of Christ, and so he tries to find a compromise. And so, the subtitle of this talk today is "The Emperor Does Theology," which is usually a dangerous thing for him to do, and it was in this case too. What he does is he gets together both sides, and he says, well, how about this? Let's compromise. And you see this time after time. Politicians love to compromise, but how do you compromise dogma?
Right.
And he says this. He says, let's say that Jesus Christ has two substances, but only one operation. Now, the term operation or will in Greek is thelema, and that's where you end up with monotheletism. Okay? So Jesus Christ has then two substances. He has a substance that is divine, as substance. He's not wanting to use that
Right.
nature, but okay, you get the idea. But that he has only one will. And he was getting away with this for a while. I mean, both sides were signing on and everything else. But there were a couple who had some real doubts. And one of those was the Patriarch of Jerusalem. His name is Sephorinos, and he had been a monk. And he was elevated to this high post because he was a holy man. But no one would have thought that he would have stood up to the emperor and to all these other patriarchs and done theology back at them. But that's exactly what he does, and denounces this and says, hey, wait a second, you are compromising with the doctrines of the great councils. And so then he then writes to Pope Honorius in Rome. And the Pope takes a look at this. He had not been paying attention to it. He had a lot of other things going on. He starts paying attention to this, and then he writes to the emperor and challenges the emperor. And he says, basically, monotheletism is no more legitimate than monophysitism. And the emperor should have looked around at his own map, because the fact of the matter is that those people for whom this really made a difference were all under Muslim control now anyway. So it was kind of a moot issue. Well, Heraclius dies. He is succeeded by another emperor, Constans II. And what he does is he decides he's going to solve this problem by forbidding anyone from talking about it.
Oh.
Well,
So
that would
that's
mean...
going to work.
Yeah, really, as if, yeah. And not only that, but the new Pope, Pope Martin, saw this as being wrong, because if you were not allowed to talk about the heretical part of this, then you couldn't talk about the Orthodox part of it either. And so he calls the emperor on that and basically condemns the emperor for promoting heresy by demoting orthodoxy. Constans then arrests the Pope, has him brought to Constantinople, and shortly after he dies.
The Pope dies?
The Pope dies,
Okay.
yeah. Things are kind of quiet for a while. Nobody says anything. However, another Pope comes along, and this is Vitalian, Pope Vitalian. And he agrees, this is 2 popes later, he agrees with the emperor to make peace with this stuff. Okay, let's turn down the volume, let's let reason take its course, and we'll see what happens. Constans then shows his agreement with the Pope by going to Rome. This is in 663.
Okay.
But when he gets there, he uses it as an opportunity to frighten all of the priests of Rome. Now remember that the priests of Rome are the electors of the next pope. And he basically shows his power in such a way to these priests. You don't cross me, or if you do, you might end up like Pope Martin I.
Wow.
And the best anyone could tell is that Pope Martin died in exile because he was starved to death. These are some pretty mean guys.
Wow.
So Constans II got his way. He scared the bejeebers out of the priests of Rome. But he also, before he went home, went on something of an antiquarian expedition, and he stole all kinds of ancient Roman art. And he put it on his ships, and he shipped them on back. He also ordered that from now on, the Archbishop of Ravenna would receive his pallium from Constantinople, not from Rome. To make things worse, when this old pope, this Vitalian, Pope Vitalian, finally stood up to the emperor and said, hey, look, you're going too far with this stuff. I thought you were a man of peace. What's going on here? What happens instead is that the Archbishop or the of Ravenna is ordered by the emperor to excommunicate the Pope.
Oh. Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's terrible. And finally, in 668, Constans II leaves the scene. It's the only thing that brought peace, and that's because he was assassinated.
Okay.
Now, a new emperor comes on the scene. This is Constantine IV. He calls for a council to solve all of these questions. It would be held in Constantinople. It was to condemn both monophysitism and monotheletism. He sends a letter out to the Pope that reads the following. This is the salutation. To the head of the first see of the universal church, standing on the firm rock of faith.
Okay,
Pretty
sounds
good. By this time, the chief opposition, those who were favoring the monos, would have been the patriarchs of Alexandria and Jerusalem and Antioch. All three of them now have been reduced and lost to Christianity because of the surge of Islam. Well, eventually, this takes, by the way, this council takes place, everything is smooth over, everything's wonderful. And then 11 years later, you begin having other events that take place, because now there are only two great patriarchs that are left in the church. You have Rome, of course, and remember that Rome is in huge chaos. All of Italy is just a dangerous place to be. And then you have Constantinople. But keep in mind that Rome is an important city, and that the church in Rome is founded by none other than St. Peter, right? Constantinople is a very important city. Who founded the church in Constantinople? There wasn't any apostle.
Right.
You know, it was done centuries later by Constantine when he built the city. So you don't have the pedigree that you do, but you do have the rivalry. and so what we begin seeing is that the church in the East, specifically the Patriarch of Constantinople, begins to exert a little bit more independence, a little bit more authority, sometimes working with the emperor, sometimes working against the emperor. And the emperors are always being motivated by politics, not by theology and not by church discipline. So, for instance, in 691, the Patriarch of Constantinople calls a council. Now, this is not an ecumenical council. It's going to be a local council for his own region, and it's called the Council of Trullo. The reason is that it's held in a building called the Trulon in Constantinople, and it simply means a domed hall.
Okay.
So it's in a hall. But the Council of Trulon is important because of some of the things that it decides, and also by the fact that the councils had always been signed off on by popes. Here you have a council that is not signed by the Pope. This is Pope Sergius. He does not sign the acts. And mainly because of two changes that are made by the Eastern bishops at the behest of the Patriarch of Constantinople. First of all, a prohibition of fasting on Saturdays.
Okay.
That might seem a little strange to us, but just take it for what it is. But the other one that's more important for us is the alteration of clerical celibacy. Now, we can talk about this some other time, or no, we will, in fact, talk about the history of clerical celibacy in the Catholic Church, which has apostolic origins.
Right.
And throughout the centuries was respected and held in high esteem, and also was honored in the breach, because often it was violated, and often councils and popes and synods had to come back again and say, hey, these are the rules, this is how we do it. And from time to time actually did a little theology as to why. But the reality was that that clerical celibacy had been with us from the very beginning. Now at the Council of Trullo, there is an innovation. The bishops then turn around and they say, well, yeah, that's okay for monks. But for the secular clergy, that is, say, diocesan clergy, they would be allowed to remain married after ordination. In fact, in the West, the same thing was also true.
Okay.
There were married priests, married bishops, married popes. But after they received ordination, they lived a celibate life along with their spouse, living a celibate life also. It's one of the reasons from very early on the the spouse had a say into whether or not that person, her husband, would be ordained. Yeah. But here's the change, that the priest would be allowed to remain married after ordination, and that they would, however, not be allowed to advance to be a bishop. Now, there'll be nuances that'll come about, but that's the beginning of this change between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And even to this day, Eastern churches that are united to the Catholic Church, the Uniate churches, themselves maintain this discipline. That's why you'll have married clergy with families in the Eastern churches. And,
so that came from Trullo.
Trullo,
okay.
Yeah. And in 690, what did I say, 691? Yeah. Pope Sergius refused to sign this. He did not agree with this. So the new emperor, Justinian II, sent an order to the Italian peninsula, to the Byzantine army that was there, to go and arrest him, and with that bring him back to Constantinople, where he would receive the Martin I treatment. In other words, he'd be martyred. And what happened instead was the Byzantine army in Italy refused the orders. So now you have then a later emperor that comes along, and he changes his position because he's concerned that he needs to have allies in the West. And so see how the policies will change back and forth? And so this new emperor comes along. He invites the Pope to come to Constantinople. It turns out that it just happened to be Pope Constantine. So Constantine the Pope goes to Constantinople. The two of them have a happy good time. Everything is wonderful, and then this emperor Justinian II dies.
Okay.
This is in 711. He doesn't die of natural causes. He and his entire family are massacred.
Wow.
His nickname, by the way, is his title is Justinian II, but his nickname was Rhinometus, which means his nose cut off.
Oh.
In an earlier revolt, his enemies had literally taken and cut his nose off. He survived the ordeal.
Oh my gosh.
But you can imagine how he must have looked.
Oh.
I think the key here is that these are some pretty rough times.
Yes.
When you get into the early 700s in the East, we look at these guys going around all dressed up and all that, but these are rough times. And here you have his entire family was just brutally murdered, and then for the next 6 years there's nothing but anarchy in the Byzantine Empire, and of course that allows all of the enemies on the borders to begin playing around. Finally, another emperor asserts his control. This is the Emperor Leo III. Just in the nick of time, he's able to rally the defenses in Constantinople and defends it against another Arab assault. Again, he's using Greek fire, and also they make a huge chain that goes all the way across the port so that the ships couldn't get in. The Arab ships couldn't
The chain
get
of
in.
Greek fire to do that, or?
No, it's a combination. So you've got the chain itself.
Oh, a chain, a real chain.
A real chain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that goes all the way across the mouth of the harbor, and then you also have the Greek fire. So those two things save the city once again. After he's survived that, he then updates the Justinian Code.
Okay.
It's a certain section of the code called the Novellae, and it makes it more contemporary. And two things in particular. There's one document called the Ecloga, which is a series of laws with, and I quote here, with the view to greater humanity. Here is an emperor who is going to try to use Christian principles to humanize his empire. And then also there's another rural code. Here, once again, this kind of backs up what Rodney Stark is talking about. Here, based on Christian principle and the concept of human dignity, that's that Christian anthropology, things like slavery are outlawed. Now, this is in the early
Wow, this is
700s. Yeah.
You have all kinds of other horrible things going on.
Right, yeah. But every once in a while, a little shining
Little
light.
shimmers of,
Yeah. And so he has that, and he also guarantees personal property rights for peasants. He allows for communal ownership of certain property that is too big for any one individual, so they all share in it together. He also abolishes something later on, it's called the corvée, which is a work tax. Peasants have to work for the government so many days out of the year. He abolishes all of that. So, I mean, things are, looking pretty good.
That sounds, all sound good.
And, of course, you have to have another controversy. No. And what he ends up having to work with is iconoclasm. Here you had, you finally put aside the two monos, and now comes along iconoclasm. And one has to wonder where on earth this comes from. Well, it's really interesting. From a Muslim point of view, they'll say that iconoclasm came from Monophysite Christians and from Jews.
Okay.
On the other hand, the Christian authors will look at Muslims and Jews and say, well, this is where it came from, as well as the Monophysites. So let's just look at this. First of all, images are restricted in Judaism. The Ten Commandments make that very clear, that you should not have images to worship. Now, our understanding of images and pictures and all that in Christianity is quite different, of course. No Catholic actually worships an idol, although we're often accused of that, especially concerning the Blessed Virgin.
Sure.
But we know we don't do that, But anyway, going back to the first of the Ten Commandments, that we have such an honor of God that we do not have carved images or images of Him that we would worship. So there is that. Also within the Quran itself, there is the statement that is made, images are an abomination of the work of Satan. Now, there are also some Christian heavyweights that weigh in on this too. For instance, at the local council of Elvira in 303 in Spain, among many other things, part of which was a clerical celibacy, the recommitment to that, there was also a condemnation of the use of pictures in churches.
Wow, okay.
We also know of an early church father, Epiphanes of Cyprus, who went into a church and saw a curtain with the image of Christ on it, and he tore it down.
Oh my gosh!
And he said, "You can't do this. You shouldn't do this." We also have the great Pope Gregory the Great, who had sent off a letter to the Bishop of Marseille, congratulating him on his directive of all the churches in his diocese to remove all icons. But then St. Gregory goes on to say, but don't throw them away. Use them in the schools because they make great teaching tools. Well, ultimately, that's going to be the solution and the understanding, and that's why we have images and statues and all in our churches today in the Catholic Church, because we understand them as helping
teaching
us as teaching tools. Yeah, they're not little gods,
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, Leo III becomes iconoclastic himself. And he takes on this idea of destroying all of these icons, and which of course is a big deal in the Eastern Church.
Oh my gosh!
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. And so you ended up with, here he thought he was going to solve the unity problem. He ends up creating a unity problem because on the one hand he has a group, we'll call them the Reformists, and that's the emperor with much of the educated class, most of the higher clergy, and the army on the one side, and on the other side you have most of the laity, including most of the women, and also most of the monks. I mean, these are the men who are making the icons, and they understand how to meditate on an icon. Obviously, the emperor didn't. Well, after 10 years of this, the emperor finally made his move, and he ordered a statue of Christ to be destroyed in the imperial palace itself, at the entrance of the imperial palace. And there was a bunch of women there, hundreds of women had gathered to protect the statue because they knew it was going to happen. And what happened was that when the official began to desecrate the statue, the women surged at him and killed him. And we said, whoa, wait a minute.
Wow.
Now, who would do this? Well, read the newspapers, what's going on right now. There are people dying over this whole question of those cartoons of Muhammad. There are people dying.
Picture just came to me. So it's almost an icon for them.
Yes.
In some respects.
Yes. Yeah. And now what happens is that the government responds by going in with soldiers and slaughtering many of these women.
Wow.
This is absolutely terrible. The Patriarch of Constantinople is so upset that he joins with the Pope, this is Pope Gregory II, in condemning the emperor and telling him, don't do this.
Wow.
And so all throughout the Christian world, this great conflict about iconoclasm continues, so much so that the emperor actually suppresses the monasteries in his part of the empire. These monks are forced to leave. They're forced to wear secular garb. In many cases, they were forced to marry. There was one occasion in which hundreds of them were rounded up, and they were just given women, and they were marched into the hippodrome for a mass wedding. This is ridiculous. Something like 50,000 people fled the Byzantine Empire, and most of them moved to Sicily or to southern Italy.
Okay.
This is going to be a real drain brain, by the way, and it's going to bring a lot of intellectuals and a lot of holy men and women into the western part of what happened in the empire. Pope Hadrian the First in 786 is going to try to solve this. There's going to be a consul, another consul at Nicaea in 787. 300 bishops are going to gather. It's going to be the last ecumenical council, and it's going to be closed down by the Byzantine army.
Oh my gosh.
They're going to try to arrest these guys, and of course they all had to take off and run.
Wow.
Oh, the things get worse.
This is a hairy time.
Oh, it is. In 780, the Emperor Leo V dies, and with that, his wife, Irene, takes over for his little baby son, Constantine VI. When Constantine is a teenager, he turns to his mother and says, okay, I'm old enough, I'll run the country now. In 797, she had a coup d'etat. She overthrew her own government. She had him blinded.
Her own son?
And then she took over as emperor, not empress. She used the word Basilios. Not Basilia, Basilios, emperor. And for 5 years, she controlled. This is from 797 to 803.
Wow.
And that's why Pope Leo III, over in Italy, when he needs help, he can't turn to the Byzantines.
Right.
Instead, he turns to this guy up in Germany by the name of Charlemagne.
Charlemagne.
And so all of this is going to start coming together, and it's all going to converge on the year 800 when the Pope and the King, soon to be Emperor, come together and then create Western civilization that we have today. Now, we've got a couple more elements to look at. Next time around, we're going to be looking at that Catholic Church.
Okay.
Because the Catholic Church, especially in Rome, is going to pull together all of these elements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Father, this is wonderful. Wonderful, I guess it sounds like a really messy time, but very interesting. We've run up to the clock again, too, so shall we close with a prayer and your blessing?
Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be.
World without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood, Good day.